They say every family argument has a breaking point, a moment so sharp that it slices through years of tolerance, patience, and quiet endurance. For me, that moment happened at a dinner table where I had sat thousands of times before. The place where birthdays were celebrated, school results discussed, and jokes shared became the setting for one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. The moment my parents shouted at me to give up my room or move out, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger at first, it was disbelief, then disappointment, and finally clarity. Clarity that pushed me to take a step I had never imagined, buying a $1.2 million house directly facing theirs. It all started months earlier when my younger brother, the golden child, decided he wanted my room. Not just any room, my room, the largest one upstairs with a balcony view and sunlight that poured in every morning. I had been living at home temporarily to save money and help my parents with a few things they needed after Dad's surgery. The arrangement was supposed to be mutually beneficial. But the longer I stayed, the more my parents seemed to forget that I was an adult contributing to the household in ways my brother never had. Slowly, the tone changed, small demands, passive-aggressive remarks, and subtle pressure. I could handle that. Families aren't perfect, but what I didn't expect was the ambush at the dinner table. We were halfway through the meal when Mom cleared her throat dramatically, the way she always did before saying something she knew would spark tension. Dad didn't look at me at first, he just fiddled with his fork. Mom began by explaining how my brother needed more space, how it would be fair if we rearranged the rooms, and how since I was almost never home, I should adjust. I tried to stay calm, reminding them that I paid rent, bought groceries, and maintained the house while they recovered. But logic had no place in that dining room. The moment I said I wasn't giving up my room, everything spiraled. Dad slammed his hand on the table, so hard the plates rattled. Mom's voice rose, sharp and cold, telling me that if I didn't want to cooperate, I could leave. Then the sentence that changed everything: give up the room or move out. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, shouted at me as if I were a burden instead of someone who had given up time, money, and comfort to support them. For a moment, the entire world went silent. Even my brother froze, though I could see a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. I took a slow breath, stood up, and walked away without another word. Not out of cowardice, but because responding would only escalate things. Instead, I decided that if they wanted me out so badly, I would give them exactly what they asked for. What they didn't know was that I had been doing well financially for a few years. Affording my own place wasn't an issue, I just hadn't rushed because I thought family mattered more than independence. But that night taught me a brutal truth: family does matter, but not at the cost of your dignity. So the very next morning, I called my real estate agent. She had shown me several listings in the past, but one particular house stood out, a stunning $1.2 million modern home right across the street from my parents'. At the time, I thought it was funny how close it was. I never imagined I'd actually buy it. Now, it felt like the perfect answer. Within 2 weeks, the paperwork was done. I packed my things quietly, without drama, without shouting, without even resentment. Just resolve. My parents assumed I was calming down and would eventually cave in. When they saw me carrying boxes to my car, they panicked, demanding to know where I was going. I simply smiled and said, "You told me to move out, so I did." They didn't take me seriously. But the moment they watched me walk into the massive house across the street with the keys in my hand, their faces drained of color. The first night in my new home felt surreal. Not because of the luxury, but because of the peace. No shouting, no tension, no attempts to control my choices. I stood by the large window facing their house and thought about everything. I didn't buy the house to show off or humiliate them. I bought it because I deserved a place where my decisions weren't questioned and my existence wasn't treated like an inconvenience. But yes, there was a bit of poetic justice in the fact that every time they stepped outside, they'd see the home of the child they pushed away. Over the following weeks, my parents tried everything: calling, texting, even coming to the door. But I needed space. I needed them to understand that their words had consequences. Eventually, they softened, apologized, and admitted they acted out of frustration, favoritism, and pressure. I accepted their apology, but things were never exactly the same again. Still, every time I sit on my balcony and see their house, I'm reminded of one important truth: sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's simply choosing yourself. The night I left my parents' house, I expected to feel broken. After all, getting kicked out by the people who raised you, over a room, of all things, is not something anyone imagines happening in their adulthood. But instead of the crushing sadness I thought I'd feel, there was an unexpected calm inside me, a quiet determination that grew stronger with every mile I drove away. I had been living in that house like a guest rather than a family member, constantly walking on eggshells, constantly adjusting, constantly being blamed for things that weren't my fault. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of self-respect. The argument at dinner had changed everything. When my parents shouted at me to give up the room or move out, I realized they didn't see me as an adult contributing to the household. They saw me as someone who owed them obedience. They saw my sacrifices, paying rent, helping with bills, handling chores, as things I was supposed to do simply because I lived under their roof. And when I said no to their unreasonable demand, they chose to treat me like a problem that needed to be pushed out rather than a child who deserved consideration. That night, I knew I had outgrown that space in more ways than one. But life has a funny way of turning pain into opportunity. And sometimes, fate seems to have a sense of humor. 2 days after I left, I checked into a hotel while searching for a new place. I hadn't planned on anything extravagant, I just wanted somewhere peaceful. But when my real estate agent sent me photos of a newly listed modern house only a few blocks from my parents' neighborhood, I felt an odd pull. Then she told me the exact location. The house was directly across from my parents' home, facing it perfectly, almost intentionally. I stared at the photos for a long time. It wasn't revenge I wanted, not at all. But there was something poetic about reclaiming control in a way that didn't hurt anyone, yet sent a message they could never ignore. The house was everything their house wasn't: open, airy, quiet, and full of warmth. Sunlight filled every corner, the living room had floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kitchen looked like it belonged in a magazine. I toured it the next morning, and by the time I reached the master bedroom overlooking the street, I knew it was mine. It felt like a new beginning, simple, calm, and deeply mine. Without hesitation, I placed an offer. Within days, it was accepted. Just like that, my new chapter began with a $1.20 million statement of independence. Moving in was the most peaceful chaos I had ever experienced. The movers came early, and I didn't bother telling my parents. I didn't owe them an announcement. But fate intervened when they stepped outside around noon and saw the moving truck parked across the street, my boxes being unloaded, and the front door of the new house wide open. I will never forget the look on their faces, shock mixed with confusion, disappointment mixed with realization. My mother called my name as if trying to stop something that had already happened. My father walked over slowly, clearly conflicted. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't throw their words back at them. I simply told them the truth. You asked me to move out. I listened. That one sentence hit harder than any argument could. They stood there silently, as if processing the weight of their own decisions. The first night inside the new house was a kind of peace I had never felt. It wasn't the expensive furniture or the luxurious space that made it special. It was the freedom, the ability to breathe without wondering who would criticize me next, the ability to make decisions without being scolded, the ability to live without feeling controlled. I walked room to room, touching the walls, opening the windows, standing in the quiet living room just to feel the stillness. For the first time in years, I felt safe inside my own life. But the real shift came the next morning when I opened the curtains and saw my parents' house across the street. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure. They would see my new life not because I wanted to provoke them, but because life had placed me there as a reminder. Sometimes the child you push away doesn't fall, they rise. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between us settled into something strangely healthy. My parents tried to reach out, at first with anger, then guilt, then finally sincerity. They admitted they had spoken in the heat of the moment, guided by pressure, selfishness, and the desire to please my brother. They confessed that they never thought I would actually leave, let alone buy a house like this. They saw the person I had become only after I had physically moved out of their shadow. We started rebuilding, slowly, with boundaries firmer than before. We spoke as adults, not as parents trying to control their child. There was still hurt, still tension, still memories of that dinner argument, but there was also understanding growing in the space between us. Sometimes I stand on my balcony at night, watching the lights in their house, thinking about how everything changed because of one argument. But instead of bitterness, I feel grateful. If they hadn't pushed me out, I might still be living under their expectations, shrinking myself to fit their comfort. Instead, I'm living in a home built on my own courage, my own choices, and my own quiet victory. And every morning when I look across the street, I'm reminded that sometimes the most powerful comeback isn't dramatic, it's simply choosing a better life for yourself.